We're going to look at Faithful, and again, I'm in the middle of this one. So the post that I wrote following the Dark Tower post is my before Faithful post. So I talk about, in cases where I've actually read the book, I kind of talk about what the moment when I picked up the book, what I was doing in my life at that point, what I remember, that kind of thing. With books I haven't read or I've avoided reading, I talk about what I know about the book, what I'm thinking as I'm getting ready to go into it, and then my after post will come after that. So again, it's the same introduction. Richard Chismar of Cemetery Dance came up with the idea of Stephen King revisited, and I post my own blogs with the ones I read. So we'll jump into the meat of the article here. This one's a good bit shorter because, of course, all the detail comes after you read the book. All right, the nonfiction co-written journal style, Faithful, is quite a transition from the final three Dark Tower books in a row, back into some nonfiction and some baseball with Faithful. Faithful follows the 2004 Red Sox season, the one where they won the World Series again finally. It's interesting, when they started this book, they didn't know what was going to happen, of course. So they just decided in 2004 that the Red Sox had a pretty good team and maybe they had a chance of making it, but they kind of felt that way in the past. And so King and Stuart Onan, friend of King's, I'm not even now reading the book. I'm not quite sure what Onan does for a living. I imagine he's a writer of some sort, of course. But they write these journals about the season, what they were doing, how they felt at different points, things that happened to them, and then other details and memories. I'm going to reserve judgment until I finish the whole thing, but these were my thoughts going in. I read an essay about Owen King's Little League team going deep into the championships, the state championships, at the end of Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It was one of the essays in that collection. The collection Nightmares and Dreamscapes is kind of all over the place. It has essays, it has screenplays. It's sort of like a clearinghouse of all the stuff King had lying around at that point, and at the same time, some of my favorite stuff is in there. This one essay, which I believe appeared in the New Yorker, made me feel better about jumping into this book once it came up. When I read how Stephen King wrote about baseball, I was actually I felt a little better about going into this baseball book. I'm a baseball fan, but sitting and reading about like how someone bobbled a play at second and then what happened in the eighth inning and all that kind of detail about game after game after game isn't the most interesting thing to me. But the way that King wrote about baseball in that essay about his son's little league team going so far into the playoffs actually made me more excited about reading this book. I'm a fan of his nonfiction work. That includes, of course, On Writing, Dance Macabre, which was written back in the 80s, where he talks about horror in general. Even with that book being written in the 80s, and of course you have decades and decades of writing that came after it, I still feel like it holds up. Dance Macabre, if you're a horror fan, or just kind of want to know a little bit more about writing, even though that it only deals with stuff that happened from the 80s back, it's still a brilliant work. It still is worth reading for horror fans and writers alike. My fan of his nonfiction work. His collaborative work is growing on me a little as I read through all of his works. They don't tend to be my favorite when King collaborates with someone, and some of this I think is my own baggage. So I've just decided that I like King's singular work more than his collaborations. So it's on me. It's nothing wrong with the writing, but the Talisman and Black House that he did with Peter Straub, I kind of, they're not my favorites. This Faithful book I wasn't terribly excited about. Gwendy's Button Box that he wrote with Richard Chismar, not my favorite work of his. I think Sleeping Beauties with Owen King is a little stronger, that sort of thing. But saying that I kind of have a bias against his collaborative work, but it's growing on me. Everything that I've read, I'm happy that I read it. I don't feel like I've been cheated by spending my time reading those books. My favorite nonfiction book is A View from My Seat by Armand Rosamilia. I'm hoping I'll enjoy Faithful almost as much as Rosamelia's journey with the minor league team, the Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp. What I liked about Armand Rosamelia's book is that it's good for baseball fans, but it's also good for more casual baseball fans. So, I grew up watching the Atlanta Braves, and I, enjoyed the World Series even when we weren't in it. But I'm not as much into the minutia of the game as like a diehard fan would be, like a faithful Red Sox fan. Going back to the title, now A View from My Seat from Armand Rosamilia. He's really he was a Red Sox fan as well, but he supports the minor league team for the Marlins called the Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp, and they're probably one of the more popular minor league teams, partly because they do a lot of stuff for fans at the actual game, so a lot of people will go to those games. And he followed the team for a year. He actually went on the road. He wasn't traveling with the team, but he would go to games around the South and around the country, and would attend the games, write about the games. He interviewed the players, which kind of gave some interesting insight into what their dreams were. But then he also shared stories of his own experiences as a baseball fan. So I think A View from My Seat is a strong book, partly because it has the detail that a true baseball fan would want, but then the interesting story elements, narrative, that would carry somebody who isn't necessarily a numbers person when it comes to baseball. And in my view, that makes it, in my view, that makes A View from My Seat a superior book when it comes to baseball books. I remember the year and season this book covers, the again, Back to Faithful, covering 2004. I was in the middle of getting my master's degree. I was finishing my last year of that degree. I was teaching at the time too, and my wife had moved over to South Carolina ahead of me for her job. So I was finishing up the school year. I was finishing up my master's degree. My wife was also pregnant at the time with our first son, and she moved for her job into South Carolina, where we live now. And I was finishing up. I believe I talk about it here, so let me move on through this paragraph. I drove up to see her every other weekend as I finished up that last year of teaching in Georgia. It was an unusual time for us. So my wife was pregnant. We were essentially living in two different places. I just wanted the year to be over. It wasn't a situation where it's like, oh, I'm so excited to be here teaching while my wife is in a different state. And of course, our house was connected to her job. So I was essentially living with friends, and had my possessions in my car, my clothes, and things like that. And that's just how I lived for that last half of that school year. So it was kind of a displaced time for me. And I remember watching the game and watching the Red Sox being down. And I wasn't a Red Sox fan, but I was rooting for them then. And for them to come back was wild, because of course you always felt like every game was going to be the ones where they messed it up, because of course the Red Sox always messed it up. And then after they got through the playoffs and had to go to the World Series, they still weren't done. They had to win the World Series, which was the thing that had always evaded them. And then that went one game after another, and they were just, the momentum carried them on through. So it was a fascinating season, and from that standpoint, I find it interesting watching Stephen King and Onan, who co-wrote this book, like just being frazzled through the whole season. It's almost like being and of course they mentioned this, it's like being a Red Sox fan for them is sort of a torture. It's like an obsession that they can't escape from. And so while they enjoy baseball and enjoy the game, there's more times where they feel like they're being tortured as they watch the team struggle through losing streaks, and watch the Yankees get ahead, and not knowing how this is going to end, but knowing how it's ended every other year that they've gone through. So I've really enjoyed sort of that aspect of watching these guys. I guess you call it dramatic irony, where I know how it ends, but they don't yet. The postseason was going on, and Boston was down in the championship. Stephen King was in the stands, and as I got to the house where I was staying, they interviewed him. And this was Game 4 of the championship series, and they had lost every game. So the first 3 games of that series, they were losing the 4th game, and it just looked like this was the end. So they had interviewed King like right during that fatalistic point. He had a sort of fatalistic view as the team was about to be eliminated. Then they started to come back. They came back from the brink, won that series, and powered through the World Series for the historic win. It's fascinating that he and Stuart Onan were working on notes for this book that year. I'm interested to see how that effort turned out. And so, of course, the next post in this series will be after Faithful, and then I'll move on to Colorado Kid, which will be the next one after that.